The order arrived without ceremony. No raised voices, no urgency, just ink on paper, stamped and final. Attack. Hold the line. Do not retreat. The general read it once, then again, not because it was unclear, but because clarity was the problem. He already knew what the words meant. They meant movement without fuel. They meant holding ground without reserves. They meant obeying an idea that no longer existed. By late 1944, Germany was still issuing commands as if the war could be forced back into shape. On the maps in Berlin, arrows continued to point forward. On the ground, divisions were thinning, vehicles were abandoned, and the winter was closing in. The war was no longer about maneuver. It was about endurance, and Germany was running out of both time and strength. At the front, the general watched his men dig into frozen earth. They followed orders because that was all they had left. Discipline had replaced belief. Habit had replaced hope. These were not the armies of earlier years. They were fragments, held together by routine and expectation. When the message from Berlin arrived, there was no sense of opportunity. Only wait. The kind that settles slowly, pressing down until movement becomes difficult. The order demanded immediate action, decisive counterattacks, absolute control. It spoke of resolve, of will, of turning points. It did not speak of fuel shortages, or shattered supply lines, or units reduced to half their strength. The general did not argue. There was nothing to argue with. The order was not a proposal. It was a demand that ignored reality entirely. To obey it fully would expose his flanks. To hold without movement would bleed his forces dry. To retreat would mark him as weak. Each option closed another door. He stood over the map as the room waited. The lines still looked clean. The symbols still obeyed. But the map no longer described the battlefield. It described a memory. The war as it had been, not as it was. He began to calculate. Not victory, but survival. How long a position could hold. How much ground could be traded for time. How slowly destruction could be delayed. This was no longer command in the traditional sense. It was damage control, disguised as strategy. Officially, the order would be carried out. Messages would be sent. Timetables adjusted. Reports filed. Unofficially, the attack would be delayed. The line would bend instead of break. Movements would be cautious, justified, explained away. It was here, in these quiet decisions, that something changed. Not on the battlefield, but in the mind of the men giving the orders. Germany was still fighting the Allies, but its generals had begun fighting the war itself, one careful compromise at a time. They did not call it disobedience. That word was too dangerous. Instead, it became interpretation, flexibility, tactical judgment. Orders were followed just enough to appear intact, but never enough to invite disaster. The language of command remained firm, while the reality beneath it quietly shifted. This was how the war continued, not through decisive action, but through hesitation, carefully disguised as discipline. Attacks launched late, positions held longer than instructed, then abandoned quietly in the night. Reports softened before they reached Berlin. Losses described as temporary, delays framed as prudence. Each adjustment bought a little time, and with it, a little distance from the truth no one wanted to confront. The general understood the danger of this path, not just from the enemy, but from above. Hitler demanded certainty. He demanded belief. What he received instead was compliance without conviction. The front lines moved, but belief did not move with them. It stayed behind, somewhere between the frozen fields and the dimly lit command rooms where officers spoke in careful phrases and avoided direct answers. For the soldiers, Nothing appeared different. Orders still came. Positions were still defended. The fighting continued. But beneath the routine, something vital had broken. The sense that obedience would lead somewhere. That sacrifice still served a purpose. They fought because they were told to fight, not because anyone believed it would change the outcome. The general watched this erosion with quiet awareness. He had not abandoned the war, but he no longer believed in its direction. Every decision now carried a double weight, the immediate cost, and the knowledge that none of it would reverse what was already unfolding. Victory was no longer the objective. Delay was. Preservation was. Survival, in fragments. Germany would not fall in a single moment. There would be no sudden silence across the front. The collapse would arrive gradually, disguised as resistance, stretched out over months of fighting that no longer aimed to win. The war would continue because it had to, not because it could be won. And in that reality, the most dangerous fracture was not in the lines on the map, but in the minds of the men entrusted to defend them. When commanders stop believing that orders lead to victory, war becomes something else entirely. It becomes a process of managing loss. Long before the final surrender, long before the last shots were fired, Germany had already crossed that threshold. The army still moved, the guns still fired, but the conviction that once drove them forward had quietly disappeared. Lost not in battle, but in moments like this, when a general read an order and understood with absolute clarity that obedience would only hasten the end.
Ministerium für Volksaufklärung und Propaganda ist der Luftkriegsschädenausschuss zusammengetreten.